The drunkard's child stood bound in shame beneath the scorching sun until a weathered cowboy offered her sustenance and salvation. Early summer of 1874, the blazing sun hung like a brass coin over the adobe walls and timber. Buildings of bitter springs, throwing shadows hard as iron across the dusty ground, the town square hummed with whispered malice. Sarah Bennett remained lashed to the wooden pillar, her wrists chafed raw by coarse hemp rope. Though her spine stayed rigid, her knees had begun to shake. Perspiration traced paths through the grime on her face. Her gaze held emptiness, yet defiance flickered beneath. "Cut from the same rotten cloth as her old man," muttered one merchant's wife. "That's Thomas Bennett's spawn, sure enough," another woman declared, crossing her arms. "He'd shatter whiskey jugs over men's skulls and cackle like it was Sunday. Service. She's behind on grain, salt pork, and medicine, yet struts around as if yesterday never happened." The baker's spouse snarled with venom. A rancher spat tobacco juice near the post. "Her pa demolished my storefront window. Come autumn. Let her bake there. What goes around comes around." From the plaza's edge, Reverend Morrison ascended the stone. Fountain steps. Scripture clutched tight, his voice booming across the heat like rolling thunder. "Transgression must be exposed, so the spirit can find redemption," he proclaimed. "This settlement won't be dragged to perdition by those who confuse sympathy with absolution. That woman masquerades as virtuous while bearing a sinner's legacy." Sarah remained mute. She neither begged nor lowered her eyes. Her once bright gaze, which had sparkled with dreams of schoolrooms, now held only the quiet resignation of one long surrendered to fate. None recalled how she'd once instructed the cowhand's children in reading, or how she'd mended her father's jacket through endless nights of hush and bourbon vapors. They'd forgotten her humble acceptance of every debt he'd abandoned, swallowing dignity like bitter medicine now, lacking currency to settle the destruction from her father's final bender, the shattered glass, the ruined pharmaceutical supplies, the contaminated well from his overturned car. She bore punishment, as though the transgressions were branded into her flesh. Around her, the crowd began to scatter as the sun drove them toward shade, yet condemnation kept their stares fixed. Upon her, then from the road skirting the square, a figure appeared. Marcus Stone tall, lean, wrapped in a dust-worn coat and shrouded in the quietude of loss. A man who hadn't darkened a church door since the conflict ended, who dwelled at the canyon's rim where only wind and ghosts kept vigil. His bride had perished 6 winters past. Folk claimed he conversed more with livestock than people. Few noticed him until he paused. He observed Sarah not with contempt, not with pity, but with a tranquil, measuring stillness, like a man evaluating an injured mustang that still possessed spirit. From his pack he withdrew a round loaf wrapped in fabric, fresh-baked, still radiating warmth. He stepped through the gathering, his boots raising dust clouds. Silence descended. Marcus spoke not a word. He approached the pillar deliberately, never breaking eye contact with Sarah. Then, with the gentlest motion, as if placing an infant to rest, he set the bread upon her lap. Reaching behind her, he loosened the binding with steady fingers. The rope fell away as though it had never belonged. Sarah didn't flinch. Marcus stepped back, maintaining silence. Then he turned and departed, unhurried. Unafraid, simply a man who'd accomplished his purpose. The square erupted not in clamor, but in murmurs and gasps, like cutting wind. What in blazes was that supposed to mean? Offering her bread like she deserved mercy. Man's lost his mind entirely. Reverend Morrison gripped his Bible tighter, but said nothing. Sarah gazed down at the loaf. Her trembling hands didn't reach for it immediately. But her eyes, those weary eyes, held the faintest glimmer. A fracture in the stone, a whisper in the void. The town would discuss it for weeks. Yet no one, no preacher, no shopkeeper, no gossip could erase what they witnessed that day. A woman long damned, and a man who gave her sustenance. A simple gesture, but in a settlement built on judgment. It resonated like revolution. Bitter spring's dust still clung to her skirt as Sarah crossed the hills toward her dwelling. Her wrists, scarlet from rope burns, pulsed with each stride. The town had emptied of faces, but not of censure. It pursued her like desert wind. By sunset's arrival, she reached the prairie's edge. Her shack, if one could dignify it with that term, tilted askew like an ancient man near collapse. The door groaned open with a wheeze, as though even the timber pitied her. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with smoke and perspiration. Her father, Thomas Bennett, sprawled on the narrow cot, snoring irregularly. An empty metal cup lay beside his outstretched hand. Sticky with whatever rotgut he'd bartered for the previous week, Sarah lit the kerosene lamp with unsteady fingers. The flame danced low, casting shadows on the cracked walls and water-stained ceiling. This was home now, a hovel that groaned when wind blew and whimpered during storms. A place she'd once fantasized about leaving, a place she could no longer afford to abandon. She took a damp cloth, knelt beside the fireplace, and cleaned the blood from her wrists in silence. Days drifted by. She patched the roof with discarded grain sacks and old newspapers. She boiled turnips with bones too ancient for flavor. Her aspirations of becoming an educator faded like ink on her weathered primers, now hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Safe from rodents but not from time. Then came the tempest. It arrived swiftly, sheets of rain, howling gusts, and a chill that pierced even the thickest wool. Sarah positioned buckets beneath the leaks, her hands trembling with exhaustion. By dawn, the storm had passed. As had one of the leaks, Sarah blinked, then stepped outside. New shingles, mismatched, weathered, but solid, had been nailed in place with a craftsman's precision. She touched the rope securing the tarp. The knot was familiar. Later that day, she discovered a sack of potatoes resting on her window ledge. No message, no knock, no sound, but she understood. A knot told her. The silence told her. It was Marcus Stone, the man who'd freed her. The man who'd offered bread to the shamed woman in the square. A day later, the well crank that had been seized for 3 years turned as if never rusted. She nearly wept when clean water flowed into her bucket. Sarah said nothing, but that evening she retrieved an old kettle, scrubbed it with ash and soap until it gleamed like silver, and placed it on the porch beside a chipped enamel cup. Tucked beneath the kettle, a note: "Should you return, I have hot water ready." She waited 3 days. On the 4th morning, the kettle was empty. The cup had shifted. That evening, just before twilight, she saw him. Marcus sat at her garden's edge, where the fence sagged inward. He held nothing, said nothing. Sarah walked to the porch, poured warm tea, wild mint, and dandelion from the kettle, and brought 2 cups. She handed him one. He accepted it. They sat in silence as the prairie turned golden around them. He didn't speak of the town. She didn't mention shame. They watched the grass sway gently in the breeze. Sarah glanced at him once. His expression was unreadable, but his stillness was kind. Not empty, it's quiet. For the first time in months, her spine relaxed. Her chest expanded without pain. When the cup was empty, Marcus nodded, rose, and walked away into the dusk. Watched until his silhouette faded, and she whispered to the wind. Words aren't needed to be understood. And for once, the silence didn't feel like solitude. It felt like sanctuary. Midsummer's heat settled over bitter springs like a second skin, sticky, inescapable. Dust clung to every boot and bonnet, and with it came whispers that carried louder. Then shouts. Sarah Dalton walked down the main thoroughfare with her chin raised, hands clasped behind her back, a basket hanging from one arm. She was thinner now, her eyes darker, her steps softer, but she didn't skulk. Murmurs followed her like vultures. There she goes, acting like she belongs here. She never paid for what her daddy did. Silence is the devil's disguise. From the church steps, Reverend Morrison watched her with a face carved from granite. The Bible in his grasp was open, his voice sharp, slicing through the languid afternoon. Sin that hides in quiet festers. Complicity walks hand in hand with corruption. Let not your compassion cloud your discernment. A woman who walks in shadows walks with shadows. Sarah said nothing. She continued walking, near the druggist's shop. A boy no more than 8 broke from his mother's grip, ran up, and spat at her feet. The wet slap of saliva on her boot made her freeze. Gasps followed, then hushed. Sarah didn't flinch. She looked at the child. He stared back, proud, defiant. Then a shadow passed over them both. Marcus Stone stood between them. He didn't shout or curse. Instead, he knelt, plucked a tiny wildflower from between the boardwalk planks, and handed it to the boy. The child blinked, confused. His mother pulled him away with a harsh whisper. Marcus remained kneeling. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief worn, old, embroidered with a faded M, and gently wiped the spit from Sarah's boot. She opened her mouth to speak. But he shook his head. There was no shame in his touchingly reverence. He stood slowly, then turned and walked away. Sarah stood motionless. The flower crushed under her heel, her eyes stinging not from insult, but from something else entirely. Later that day, as the sky bruised into evening, she placed a loaf of cornbread on the windowsill. Nestled inside, wrapped in paper, a note written with care. I am undeserving of your kindness, but I treasure it. The next morning a new gate stood at her yard's entrance. Cedar wood, sturdy, sanded smooth, hinges that didn't creak. No signature, no initials, just a gate that closed softly, like someone finally meant to stay. She touched it, and the rough wood felt warm beneath her fingers. She sat on the porch with tea that night, alone, watching the stars. She didn't see Marcus that day, or the next, but something in her heart shifted like a beam settling into place. 3 days passed. On the 4th, rain fell gently over the hills, the kind that nourishes, not punishes. Sarah sat in the doorway, knees drawn up, breath fogging the glass of the cup in her hands. And then it came. The tears. Not for the shame or hunger or loneliness, but because, for the first time in her memory, someone had touched her without flinching, without demanding, without expecting her to apologize first. Tears streamed down her face, not loud or wild, but steady, like spring melt from the mountains. She cried for the little girl who'd once dreamed of chalkboards and books, for the woman who'd survived the storm of others' sins, for the gate, the flower, the handkerchief, for the man who didn't ask for thanks, only left decency in his wake. Inside, her father mumbled something in his sleep. She wiped her face, stood, and closed the door. For the first time in years, it didn't creak. The frost came early that year. Sarah woke to silence, not the usual mumbling or bottle clinks from across the room. Just a stillness that settled like ashdot. Her father lay on his side, hand outstretched toward the cold hearth. His chest no longer rose. She didn't cry. She washed. His face changed his shirt, wrapped him in the blanket he used to despise because it smelled like cedar. Then she sat beside him until morning. No one came when she sent word. No neighbors, no pastor, no prayers. She dug the grave herself, hands blistered from the shovel, breath fogging in the pale light. When the hole was deep enough, she lowered him in and said, "Rest now, just rest." As she finished patting the last mound of earth, she heard hoofbeats. Marcus dismounted quietly, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, lavender, prairie daisy, sage. He walked to the grave, knelt, and laid the bundle gently on the soil. 'Cause regardless of everything else, he said, voice low and steady, he was still a father. Sarah stood motionless, tears caught in her throat but not falling. Marcus looked at her, then turned and rode off without another word. That night she lit a single candle and sat in the dark, listening to the silence. But the silence no longer frightened her. It was clean, honest. The next day she began teaching again, not in a schoolhouse, but under the cottonwood tree near her porch. 3 children came first, barefoot, shy, curious. Then 2 more she taught them letters in the dirt, stories from her old books, how to count using pebbles and buttons. She took no payment, just watched their faces illuminate. Marcus never mentioned it. But one afternoon she returned from gathering herbs to find a bundle of fresh slate boards and chalk resting by the cottonwood. She smiled but said nothing. Next week, she found a saddle on her porch, sturdy, handcrafted, beautiful in its simplicity. Her name, Sarah, was carved into the pommel's wood, small but unmistakable. When she asked Marcus about it, he only shrugged. "Put names on things I respect," he said simply, brushing sawdust from his shirt. That night, the wind blew hard. The sky roiled with thunderclouds. Sarah sat by the fire with her lesson notes, unaware of the footsteps gathering outside her home. They came with torches. A voice shouted, "This town doesn't forget." Another jeered, teaching kids like she's some kind of saint. Then came the sound of glass breaking a rock through her window. Sarah ran to the door.
Ow!
But before she could open it, the back wall caught fire. She grabbed a blanket, smothered the flames on the curtains, and screamed into the storm, "I am not my father." But they didn't listen. Smoke filled her lungs. Her hands bled from broken glass. She staggered outside as the roof groaned above her. Lightning flashed. And then hoofbeats. Marcus burst through the firelight, rain pouring off his coat. He leaped from his horse, threw his coat around her shoulders, and without a word lifted her into his arms. She clung to him as he carried her through the flames. The cabin collapsed behind them. Embers flew into the night. Marcus placed her gently onto the saddle, mounted behind her, and rode hard into the dark. Not once did he look back. The ranch sat at the edge of Red Rock country, where the land began to slope into wilderness, and stars burned clearer and colder at night. Coyotes sang here not from fear or hunger, but for the pure sound of it. Wind didn't whisper through trees. It howled across stone, clean and merciless. Sarah had never been this far out. The first morning after the fire, she woke to the soft creak of wood and the scent of cedar. Her cot was simple, but clean, positioned near a window that faced the dawn. The cabin was modest, bare walls. No ornaments, only essentials, but nothing was broken. Nothing felt abandoned. Silence filled the space, but not the kind that judged. It was the kind that waited, patient and without demand. Marcus was already outside, chopping wood. The steady thump of axe meeting pine echoed through the valley. Shh. Didn't greet her, didn't ask how she'd slept. He merely handed her a pair of worn gloves and pointed toward the northern fence line. They worked together that day, side by side. Sarah's shoulders ached by noon, but she kept at it, matching Marcus's post for post, wire for wire. He didn't praise her, he didn't need to. She saw it in the way he nodded, barely once, when the final post was set. They ate in near silence that night. She stirred beans and warmed cornbread. He fixed a cupboard hinge with quiet concentration. When he passed her the butter, their fingers brushed. It was nothing. It was everything. The next morning she fed the horse, patched a hole in the water barrel. By midweek she was planting onions and squash with Marcus on his knees beside her. Sleeves rolled, soil caked in the lines of his palms. They didn't speak much, but sometimes their eyes met and held a beat longer than before. Afternoons brought a slower pace. Sarah stitched, cleaned, sometimes read from an old copy of Longfellow she found tucked under a loose floorboard. Marcus built a gate, sharpened tools, tended to fences. Their lives ran in quiet parallel, separate, but never apart. At dusk, they drank warm water from old tin mugs and watched the sun pour fire over the mesas. Sometimes a bird would call out, sometimes a coyote answered, but mostly it was just the wind and the scrape of chair legs as they sat together. Alone, but not lonely. Marcus kept a second cot across the room. She noticed the sheets were folded. With care, the pillow dented just once each morning. He never crossed the line, never lingered too long. But she caught him watching sometimes. Not her face, but her hands as she braided rope, her legs as she stepped through rows of squashes. If remembering someone or letting someone go, then one night, thunder low in the valley, Marcus left to find a lost calf. Sarah wandered into the back room for a blanket. That was when she saw it. A photograph, faded, torn. A young woman, hair braided tight, arms crossed, eyes full of fire. Not beautiful, but unforgettable. Fierce in a way Sarah recognized. As fierce in a way Sarah once was. The frame was dusted with age. She held it gently, didn't cry, didn't ask. She understood Marcus had not saved her because she was helpless. He'd saved her because he knew what it meant to stand in ruin and still believe in kindness. That night when he returned, soaked and silent, she gave him a towel and soup. No questions, no pity. She spoke first. Your wife? She looks like someone. Who didn't back down? He paused, spooned halfway to his lips. She didn't, he said. She died with her boots on. Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his. And in that small, wordless moment, trust took root. Not love yet, but something just as strong. Silence lay over the ranch that afternoon, like a freight train arriving at dusk, slow, heavy, and unwelcome. Dust curled in the wind, brushing against the porch rails and the tips of the onion stalks drying under the eaves. A peculiar stillness met the approaching wagon, its wheels groaning, like old bones long before any voices rose from it. The sound drew the attention of every living thing. The chickens hushed. The mare, Duchess, shifted her weight uneasily and snorted. Sarah stood at the porch steps, a basket of freshly picked onions in her arms, her breath caught mid-motion. The wagon halted at the edge of the ranch, its wheels sinking slightly into the dirt. Reverend Morrison was the first to descend, thin, sharp-shouldered, eyes narrowed behind wire spectacles, clutching his Bible like a dagger sheathed in leather. Beside him, Mayor Blackwood followed slower, heavier, leaning on a polished cane, as if it were more weapon than aid. His coat bore the seal of town authority, but his face held the long-practiced look of disdain. They stood at the edge of the yard, framed by dust and disdain. Neither spoke. Marcus appeared from behind the barn. He moved without rush, tall and broad, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. There was no fear in his posture, but there was weight like a man who'd expected this visit since. The day fire lit the horizon behind Sarah's old home. Mayor Blackwood was the first to break the hush. Mr. Stone, he said, voice tight and measured, we've observed your recent ... association. It has raised concern. Reverend Morrison took a step forward. No. This woman, Miss Benetchi, carries the stain of her father's sins and her own silence. Her presence here violates the moral balance of our town. Sarah's grip on the onion basket tightened until her fingers burned, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. Blackwood continued, we cannot abide the harboring of someone so controversial. We're here to ask formally that you remove her from your property. If not, we're prepared to initiate proceedings to reclaim this land under the town charter's moral clause. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't argue. He raised one hand and motioned, silently for the men to follow him, confused but too proud to question. The two figures obeyed, trailing him past the porch, around the side of the house. Sarah remained frozen in place. He led them to the back gate, a large wooden arch framed with old wagon wheels and rusted iron hinges. Marcus opened it slowly, stepped aside, and gestured for them to step through, as soon as both men were outside. The gate he pulled it closed with a heavy thud and secured the latch. The lock clicked like a judge's gavel. The mayor turned back, lips parted in protest. But Marcus simply raised one hand, calm. Finally, he turned without a word and walked back to Sarah. They stood side by side, watching the wagon depart its wheels, kicking up more noise than it had brought. That night, the wind picked up, dragging scraps of dry hay across the yard and sighing against the windows. Sarah sat by the hearth with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm tea. She stared into it like it might give her the answer she still could not name. Marcus crouched beside her, not speaking, not touching, just present. His presence was solid, unmoving, like the foundation of a house in storm season after midnight. Sarah finally stood and walked toward the barn. Marcus followed. He saddled the horse without speaking, lifted her onto it, and swung up behind her. They rode out beneath the clear, star-swept sky. Miles passed in silence. Then Marcus reined in the horse and pointed upward. Above them, stars burned overhead, merciless and clear. I would lose the land, I would lose all respect. I would lose everything, he said. Then he turned to her. But don't ever think you're not worthy of something like this. She said nothing. She only rested her head against him as they turned home. The stars watched, indifferent. But beneath them, two people no longer measured themselves by the town's shadow. They rode back not as fugitives, but as something quieter. Stronger promise not yet spoken but already understood. The morning she left, the ranch was cloaked in a silver mist that hadn't touched the valley in weeks. It wrapped around the trees like memories, soft and reluctant to lift. Sarah stood in the doorway, her shawl drawn tight, her bag light. She looked back not at the house, but at the porch steps, the woodpile. The dusty trail where footprints from the day before had already begun to fade. The home was never truly hers, not by deed. Not by name, but it had begun to feel like it might be. She left without waking Marcus. In the kitchen, lit only by weak dawn light, she placed two things on the wooden table. A handkerchief frayed at the corners with his name Marcus stitched in uneven thread. And beside it, a small loaf of bread, still warm. The crust was split. The shape imperfect, but it was real. It smelled of effort, of care, of something she'd once feared accepting. Beneath the bread, she slid a folded note, 5 words written in her careful, almost schoolteacher handwriting. The bread I once feared. Then she stepped off the porch, her boots silent on the earth, and followed the winding trail through cottonwoods and red clay, past the last fence post, and into the mist. By midday, the mist had burned off, but Marcus had already seen the bed. Untouched, the hearth cold, the kitchen altered. He stood at the table, staring at the loaf, and the handkerchief his name stitched, not with skill, but with sincerity. He picked up the note, read it once, and folded it carefully into his coat pocket like it was scripture. He saddled the horse without a word. No guesswork, no questions. He just knew. He rode northwest through the meadow, across the old dry streamed, toward the one place that had ever held peace between them. And then the crushing turmoil. He found her there beneath the crooked oak, that bent toward the bluff like it was listening to the earth's secrets, the place where wind always came first. The place where they'd once sat and shared silence like it was sacred. Sarah was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes dry but distant. There was no surprise when she looked up. She'd heard the horse. She'd felt the shift in the air that only Marcus seemed to bring. He dismounted slowly, walked toward her, and without a word extended his hand. Sarah looked at it for a long breath. Then she reached up. Their fingers touched uncertain at first. Then certain enough, their hands closed over the space between them. Still no words. They didn't need them. They walked back to the ranch on foot, the horse trailing behind, the afternoon sun climbing. At dusk, they reached the gate, the same gate Marcus had once locked against judgment. Its wood still bore scorch marks, still leaned slightly from age, but it stood, and Marcus opened it. Sarah stepped through. A week later, a small crowd gathered in the pasture. There was no steeple, no choir, no bouquet wrapped in ribbon, but there were chairs matched, creaking under the weight of children Sarah had taught to read. Neighbors who once whispered now watching quietly. Sarah wore a dress sewn from muslin, simple and plain. Her hair was pinned back. Marcus wore a white shirt, the same one from every Sunday he never went to town. He slipped a ring onto her finger, crafted from a melted coin, reshaped and polished until it gleamed like nothing had ever tarnished it. She placed one on his a loop of wire from the first fence he'd built on that land. They said few words, no rehearsed vows, no preacher's blessing. It's Marcus's voice, steady and true. You will never stand alone again. Then wind swept across the pasture, and they kissed, soft, uncertain, wholly real. A wedding not recognized by law, but blessed by something older, by dust, by effort, by choice. And Sarah, once tied to a market post under the harsh judgment of sun and men, now stood in a field of quiet things, chosen entirely and forever by one. 3 years later, the ranch no longer stood in silence. Laughter rang through the fields like wind through wheat. Small voices, high and bright spelling words, chasing chickens. Hammering crooked nails into soft wood. Under Marcus's patient gaze, Sarah sat on a low stool beneath the front awning. Chalk in one hand, a worn book in the other, as she pointed to letters drawn on a plank propped against a hay bale. S is for sky, she said gently, and H is for home. A dozen little heads nodded, some dark, some golden. Some copper-skinned, all watching her with wide eyes and the kind of trust that once seemed extinct. They came from everywhere. The ranch had become a haven, not just for the two who found it, but for those who needed its quiet promise. Children of ranch hands, wanderers, freedmen, widows. They arrived with no past worth speaking of, and Sarah gave them a language for their future. Marcus built the desks from pine. He taught the older ones how to mend saddles, how to treat a horse's limp, how to read a weathered sky and know when to bring the herd in early. Some days he spoke more than anyone expected. Other days he only smiled, sitting quietly as the young ones listened to Sarah read tales of faraway kings and brave girls who could not be broken. Above the door of their home, a sign hung, a patch of linen carefully embroidered in Sarah's hand. Home, not judged. No one asked where it came from. No one needed to. And each week, without fail, a small loaf of bread appeared on the windowsill. Sometimes sweet, sometimes crusty and plain. Always warm. No one ever saw who left it, but the meaning was clear. Bread still mattered. It had begun. Everything. It reminded them all that kindness left in silence could echo louder than sermons ever had. Then one spring morning, with dew still on the grass and bird songs spinning through the trees, a small voice rang out from the open doorway. Marcus turned from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, just as a little girl came barreling toward him, bare feet, curls flying, arms wide. He bent, catching her with a soft grunt, lifting her into his arms, like it was the only thing he was meant to do in this life. Her laugh spilled against his chest. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, watching. Her hands were still dusted with flour from kneading the morning bread. Her hair was a mess of braids half fallen from a day's work and play. But her eyes, those eyes that once had known only stone and silence, were lit now with something whole. She looked at Marcus. Then at their daughter curled against him. She whispered to no one in particular. I am your wife now, not just in grief, but in living, in hope. The wind lifted the edge of the linen sign, as if in gentle agreement. The ranch, once silent and judged, had bloomed into something else entirely. Not perfect, not forgotten, but forgiven. And that girl who'd once been tied to a post for the shame of someone else's sins now stood behind her own doorframe, holding a home together with nothing but will work. And the man who'd once offered her bread instead of pity, the girl, the woman, the mother, she had become all three. And she'd done it not by asking permission from a world that never offered any, but by accepting a love that had spoken through action when words had failed. And Marcus never stopped carrying a spare loaf in his saddlebag, just in case. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever believed that a simple loaf of bread could change a life, or that love doesn't need permission to be real,